The Ottawa whined off the river, carried ice crystals when my father held up his gilded invitation card outside the iron gates of Rideau Hall and spoke loudly enough for the queue behind him to hear. "You're just a glorified civil servant," he said, his eyes sweeping over my uniform with the same expression he reserved for tracking mud across his marble foyer. 85,000 a year, shuffling papers for the federal government. I don't want you standing beside me in that thing tonight. My brother Colin stood to his left, scotch warm and grinning. My sister-in-law Portia had already turned away to study the stone facade of the hall, as if disassociating from the scene entirely. My mother, Elspeth, stood behind them with both hands gripping her evening bag, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. She had not spoken a single word to me since I arrived. I stepped forward to the RCMP security checkpoint and presented my identification. What happened in the next 30 seconds, and the 4 words the chief of the defense staff spoke when he walked across that courtyard toward me in full-dress uniform, erased the self-satisfied look from my father's face so completely that he became, in an instant, a man I had never seen before. But to understand how that moment happened, I need to take you back exactly 1 week, to the dining room in Rosedale, to the dinner table where everything began and everything ended. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should have known better, please take a second to like this video. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'll be right here when you get back. Don't go anywhere, because what you're about to hear is not the kind of thing you forget. 7 days before that night in Ottawa, the chandelier above my father's dining table threw fractured light across the silverware, the bone china, and the faces of the people who had once called me family. The house was in Rosedale, the kind of Toronto neighborhood where old money grew quietly behind stone walls and ornamental iron gates, where the driveways were long and the hedgerows were deliberately high, and the neighbors minded their own business because their business was equally worth minding. My father had lived there since before I was born. The house smelled the way it always had: linseed oil, cedar, and the faint ghost of decades of expensive single malt. I had driven the 4.5 hours from Ottawa that afternoon. I had told myself somewhere on the 401 that it was just dinner, that I could sit for 2 hours and drive back and let nothing touch me. I had been in briefing rooms where 2-star generals raised their voices and said things they didn't mean. I could manage a Sunday dinner with my family. What I could not have predicted was how completely they had abandoned even the pretense of civility. Colin sat at the far end of the table with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, leaning back in his chair the way men do when they believe every room belongs to them. He had a glass of Macallan in his hand and a smile that hadn't reached his eyes in years. Portia sat beside him in a silk dress with her hair in a careful updo, her diamond earrings scattering small sparks across the ceiling. She laughed at everything Colin said and nothing anyone else did. My mother sat across from me. She had not looked at me once since I sat down. She spoke to Colin in the warm, unhurried voice she reserved for people whose company she genuinely enjoyed. When she needed to address me, she addressed a space approximately 6 inches to my left. My father, Leonard, sat at the head of the table and carved the lamb with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who carved everything in his life: legal arguments, family decisions, other people's futures, with the same controlled confidence. "The letter of intent is signed," Colin announced, raising his glass. $350 million. The contract for the National Defense Communications Grid belongs to Pendleton Group. Portia made a small, delighted sound and reached across to squeeze his arm. Her rings caught the light. "Bay Street is going to be talking about this for the next decade," my father said, satisfied. He set down the carving knife with a quiet click. "We'll close on the Muskoka property this summer, expand the Whistler place. Proper renovation this time, not patching." "We are absolutely not flying commercial for the Whistler trip," Portia said, lifting her wine. "I've been saying this for 2 years and nobody has listened." My mother reached across the table and set a small portion of lamb on my plate in the absent mechanical way you might set out a dish for a cat you've grown tired of. "And you?" my father said, looking at me for the first time that evening. "Still in Ottawa? Still doing whatever it is you do at that building?" "I'm still with the communications security establishment," I said. My voice was level. I had trained it to stay level. Colin snorted, actual audible dismissal. "CSE," he said, drawing out the letters with theatrical boredom. "Canada's answer to the NSA, except nobody has ever heard of you and you make less than my paralegal." He picked up his scotch. "What do they pay a senior analyst these days? 85, 90? I paid that in property tax last quarter." "She had every opportunity," my father said, as if I were not sitting 4 feet from him. "I paid for Queens. I paid for everything that made those doors available to her. And she chose to become a paper shuffler in a government building eating reheated cafeteria food while her brother reshapes national defense infrastructure. He pointed his fork at Colin. That is vision, knowing where the real power sits. What none of them knew, what not one of them at that table had the slightest awareness of, was that I was the reviewing authority for the National Defense Communications contract they were celebrating. The final authorization to proceed sat on my desk in Ottawa with my name on the signature line, and it had not yet been signed. The dinner moved forward. The lamb grew cold, and the scotch kept flowing, and my family's mouths kept running in the way they always did when they believed themselves to be among allies. Colin told a story about a working group at Treasury Board. Portia made 3 separate comments about Whistler real estate. My mother lifted and lowered her wineglass at regular intervals like a metronome. Then my father reached beneath his chair and placed a document on the table in front of me. A property transfer deed. My grandfather's land in Prince Edward County, 3 acres and a farmhouse on the lake, the only thing he had left specifically to me when he died. The only thing in my life that had not been shaped, purchased, or controlled by the man sitting at the head of this table. Sign it, he said. I looked up. Why? Colin leaned forward, and the performance of patience evaporated off him like steam. We need clean collateral for an offshore transfer. It's part of how we're structuring the arrangement with our international partners. We need an asset that doesn't appear connected to Pendleton Group on paper. I set down my fork. You're describing money laundering, I said. Portia made a dismissive gesture with her wrist. It's financial restructuring. Don't use words you don't understand. Which international partners? I asked. Colin's smile had a different quality now. We have relationships with a consortium based in Zurich and Singapore. They have connections to certain government-adjacent entities abroad. It smooths the process. Government-adjacent entities, I repeated. In which governments? Don't be tiresome, my father said. I reached out, picked up the fountain pen they had placed beside the deed, turned it once between my fingers, and set it down on the white tablecloth. Not on the deed, beside it. No, I said. My brother's face changed in the way faces do when someone has broken a rule they didn't know existed until it was broken. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned toward me. You don't get to say no, he said. I am a senior partner at a Bay Street firm. I have relationships with the Solicitor General's office, with the Treasury Board Secretariat, with 3 people on the federal bench. If you refuse to sign this, I will contact the Security Intelligence Review Committee. I will put together a file suggesting you accessed restricted contract data without authorization. You will be suspended pending investigation, and you will never hold another government position in this country. I will personally make sure of it. The dining room was very quiet for a moment. The chandelier hummed faintly overhead. What my brother had not noticed, what none of them had noticed, not once during the entire dinner, was that I had been recording since the moment I walked through the front door. Concealed in the bezel of my watch was a device issued to senior intelligence analysts at CSE, encrypted, tamper-resistant, transmitting in real time to a secure server at our Ottawa facility. Every word my brother had just said about offshore transfers, international intermediaries, and fabricating a fraudulent review against a federal officer was already on record. I had been recording since before I sat down. I folded my napkin into a careful square, aligned the edges, and set it beside my plate. You are making a permanent decision, I said quietly. Every single one of you, I want you to understand that. My father stood, walked to the wall safe concealed behind the Lauren Harris painting in the hall, a group of 7-piece my grandfather had bought in the 1960s, punched in the combination, and returned with 4 cream-colored envelopes, each one bearing the official seal of the Governor-General of Canada. Tickets to the state dinner at Rideau Hall the following Saturday. He held them up. You were going to come as my guest, he said, to sit at the table where the contract will be formally announced, to see what it looks like when your family is recognized at the highest level in this country. He pulled one envelope from the stack and let it fall onto the tablecloth in front of my plate. But not anymore. You'd embarrass us. The officers at that table would be nauseated to see me harboring a low-level government functionary. He pointed toward the front hallway. Leave this house. When your government position evaporates and you find yourself with no one to call, don't call here. The Pendleton name means something. You chose not to be part of what it means. My mother raised her wineglass. She did not look at me. Go embrace your $85,000 a year, she said, and drank. I stood slowly and let the chair legs drag against the hardwood as I rose, a small, deliberate sound in the silence of the room. I looked at each of them in turn. My father rigid with certainty. My brother flushed with borrowed power and rye whiskey. Portia already reaching for her phone to arrange what she'd do with the extra ticket. My mother studying her wine as if the glass had become suddenly interesting. "You've made a permanent decision," I said. "All of you, remember that you made it first." I walked down the hallway toward the front door. As I passed the study, I saw my brother's laptop open on the desk, screen still live, session still active. He had not locked it, he had not even dimmed it. The confidence of a man who believes himself untouchable is a very particular kind of blindness. From the interior lining of my jacket, I removed a data extraction device, smaller than a thumbnail, standard issue for CSE field operatives, and walked past the desk without breaking stride. My hand brushed the edge of the laptop, the device found its port. I counted seconds silently and kept walking. 1, 2, 3. My posture didn't change, my pace didn't shift. I looked exactly like what I was supposed to look like, a woman who had just been cut loose collecting her coat on the way out the door. 12 seconds later, the indicator on my watch flashed green, complete. I extracted the device, shrugged on my overcoat, and closed their front door behind me without making a sound. The 401 was nearly empty at that hour. The lights of Toronto fell away behind me, and the highway stretched northeast toward Ottawa in the dark. I drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the weight of what I had just heard settling into something cold and precise in my chest. I did not cry. I had not cried since my grandfather's funeral, and I did not intend to start in a government fleet vehicle on a winter highway because my father had pointed at the door. I was at my desk before 2 a.m. I had expected to find financial irregularities. I had expected offshore accounts and nominee directors and the kind of layered corporate structures that Bay Street lawyers build specifically to make evidence difficult to trace. Standard white-collar fraud, serious but contained. What I found instead stopped me cold. Buried inside the Pendleton Group server files was a document I recognized immediately. The classified interior architecture specifications for the National Defense Communications Grid. The one with the designation that does not appear on any public procurement document. The one that does not leave the secure servers at D&D. It had been transmitted. The metadata showed a destination address that resolved to a server cluster in a country that appears regularly in our classified threat assessments. I opened the communications log. Pendleton Group had not simply bribed its way to a federal contract. They had sold the core technical architecture of Canada's new national communications network to a foreign intelligence service. And embedded inside the version they had submitted to the Crown, the version they wanted signed and deployed across Canadian Armed Forces networks, was a deliberate vulnerability. A gap in the encryption layer. A 14-minute window during which every secure channel in the CAF would be fully exposed to external interception. 14 minutes, enough time to unmake things that cannot be remade. I pressed my palms flat on the desk and breathed through it, then I kept reading. In a subfolder misfiled under a project code I didn't recognize, there was a video, low resolution, shot in a hotel suite, Zurich, based on the skyline visible through the window in one corner of the frame. My father and Colin sat across a low table from two men I recognized from intelligence briefings I was not supposed to be able to discuss in any public setting. Their body language was relaxed, comfortable, familiar. My father swirled a glass of wine, he crossed his legs, he spoke with the casual ease of a man who knows exactly how the conversation ends. One of the men across the table asked about federal exposure. About what would happen if Canadian authorities traced the transaction structure back to Pendleton Group. My father smiled. "We have a contingency," he said. "My daughter works inside CSE, senior analyst, full clearance. We've already routed several transactions through credentials that closely mirror her access profile. If anyone starts looking, the forensic trail reads as originating from her. She'll face an internal review, a court-martial if we're fortunate. Everything points to her, and we walk away clean." Colin laughed. He actually laughed. He leaned across the table and shook hands with the man nearest to him. I stopped the playback. I sat in the dark of my office with both hands flat on the desk and let the full weight of what I had just watched settle into place. They were not simply selling the country's security infrastructure to a foreign adversary for 9 figures. They were planning to burn my name, my clearance, and my career to the ground to ensure they walked away from it without consequence. The only things in my life they had never touched. The work I did in rooms they would never see, protecting people who would never know my name, those were the things they had decided to use as kindling. If you're as outraged by this as I was, please hit that like button right now and type the word justice in the comments, because what I did next was about a great deal more than my family. I picked up my secure line and called the chief of the defense staff directly. He answered on the second ring. I briefed him completely. No summary, no softening, every document, every transmission log, every second of the Zurich recording. He was quiet for a moment when I finished. Authorization granted, he said. Full operational latitude. Coordinate with RCMP National Division. I want this airtight before the Rideau Hall dinner. A pause. One more thing. Sir? Wear your dress uniform. The days that followed were quiet on the outside and relentless beneath the surface. I worked in 12-hour rotations, cross-referencing the extracted data against CSE intercepts that now resolved into clarity. RCMP National Division assigned 6 investigators to the financial crimes thread. The evidence was dense and clean. My brother had been meticulous in building the offshore structure and catastrophically careless about where he stored the underlying documentation. That was the thing about people who believe themselves untouchable. They stopped practicing basic security long before they stopped needing it. By Thursday, we had everything we needed. The RCMP commissioner and I stood over a floor plan of Rideau Hall in a conference room at the National Division building on Elgin Street. She traced the main entrance corridor with her finger. We can take them quietly at the Rosedale house, she said. Controlled environment, minimal exposure. I looked at the floor plan for a moment. They chose this dinner, I said. They used the contract announcement as a vehicle. They were going to stand in that room and accept recognition for an infrastructure deal built on sold secrets and a forged evidence trail pointing at me. I looked up. I want them arrested in that room. She studied me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. As you wish, she said. 12 RCMP officers in formal evening attire, seated throughout the hall as guests, 4 federal prosecutors, 2 CSE technical analysts with complete evidence packages ready to transmit. The trap was set, and the Pendleton family had purchased their own tickets to the event. Standing at the Rideau Hall gate on Saturday evening, I watched my father's face as the RCMP corporal examined my identification wallet and saw what was inside. The corporal straightened. He stepped back and came to full attention. The 2 officers flanking the checkpoint followed without a word. From across the stone courtyard came the sound of footsteps. The chief of the defense staff, in his full-dress uniform, crossed the courtyard toward the gate, toward me. He stopped 3 feet away, posture-perfect expression carrying the particular quality of respect that cannot be performed, only accumulated over years of earned trust. He saluted. Lieutenant Colonel Pendleton, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard and into the cold November air. Welcome to Rideau Hall. 4 words. That was all. But in the silence that surrounded them, with my father standing 6 feet behind me, holding his gilded invitation card in a hand that had begun to tremble, those 4 words undid 15 years of dinner table verdicts in under 5 seconds. My father made a sound I had not heard from him before, something small and involuntary, like a seam giving way. Colin had gone the color of old paper. Portia's hand had found his arm and was gripping it hard enough to wrinkle his sleeve. My mother stood perfectly still, both hands around her evening bag, her eyes on me with an expression I could not interpret and chose not to try. Colin stepped forward toward the security post, his voice cracking at the edges. We're with her, he said. We're family, we're together. I stopped walking. I turned and looked at each of them, slowly, deliberately, one at a time, the way I had once scanned a room before a difficult operational briefing. I don't know these people, I said, to no one in particular. My voice was calm, but their tickets are valid. Let them through. I turned and walked through the gates of Rideau Hall. The ballroom was at full attendance when the chief of the defense staff took the podium. The room, high ceilings, crown molding, the deep red of the official standard draped behind the dais, went quiet when he spoke. He addressed the room briefly about the national communications grid, about the scale of the contract, about the importance of security in an era of unprecedented digital threat. Then he said, "Tonight we are honoring the officer whose investigative work uncovered a threat to that infrastructure, and to this country, before it could cause irreparable harm. Please welcome the Senior Director of Intelligence Operations, Communications Security Establishment." The doors opened. I walked in wearing my dress uniform, not because I had been instructed to, because 15 years of service had earned every thread of it, and I was not going to walk into the most important room of my career in anything else. From somewhere to my right, I heard the sound of the Pendleton table registering my presence. A sharp collective intake of breath, the scrape of a chair, Portia's low, stricken sound that she tried immediately to swallow. I did not look at them first. I walked to the front of the room and took the position indicated and looked out at the assembled ministers, senior officers, and flag officers who had risen politely to their feet. Then I looked at the Pendleton table. My father's wineglass had toppled. It lay on its side on the white tablecloth, with a red stain spreading outward through the linen. He was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on him before in all the years I had sat across from him in Rosedale. It was the expression of a man who has wagered everything on a certainty and understood in a single moment that he had been wrong about all of it. Colin had both hands over his face. I pressed the small remote in my palm, the screens behind me illuminated. "The National Communications Grid," I said, my voice filling the room through the speakers, was compromised before it was built. The classified interior specifications for Canada's secure military communications network were transmitted to a foreign intelligence service by Pendleton Group, the contract's prime bidder. A deliberate vulnerability was embedded in the architecture to create a 14-minute exposure window across all CAF encrypted channels. I paused. In addition, the principals of Pendleton Group constructed a false forensic trail using credentials that mirrored those of a federal intelligence officer, designed to direct any investigation toward her and away from them. I looked at the room. I am that officer. The stillness in the ballroom had a physical quality. A general at the front table stood up. A deputy minister leaned toward her colleague. Across the room, the RCMP commissioner caught my eye and gave a single brief nod. I turned to the chief of the defense staff. I came to attention and saluted. "Sir," I said, "the evidence package has been transmitted to Crown prosecutors. The rest falls under your jurisdiction." He returned the salute without hesitation. "RCMP," he said, in a voice that reached every corner of the room, "proceed." 12 officers in evening attire moved simultaneously. Colin was on his feet and pushing back from the table before they reached him. He made it approximately 3 steps before they had him. The handcuffs were very loud in the silence of the ballroom. Portia demanded to know if the officer who presented his badge had any idea who her husband was. The officer informed her, with complete composure, that all domestic and offshore assets associated with Pendleton Group had been frozen by court order as of that afternoon. She screamed something at him and had to be escorted toward the service corridor with her heels dragging against the floor. My mother did not scream. She sat very still in her chair and watched everything unfold with the glacial composure that had always been her particular armor, and it held until they moved toward my father, and then it cracked. My father dropped to his knees. I have replayed this many times and it never becomes simpler to describe. The man who had stood at the head of the Rosedale table his entire adult life, who had pointed at doors and delivered judgments, and treated every room he entered as a room that already belonged to him. He was on his knees on the ballroom floor of Rideau Hall with his hands being secured behind him, and tears running into the lines around his mouth. "Natalie," he said. My name in his voice sounded like something he had borrowed and was only now attempting to return. "We're blood. You have to help me." I looked down at him. "The only thing I owe this country," I said, "is the truth, and I've given it." I nodded to the officer beside him. They removed my family through the service corridor, the sound of their voices fading as the heavy doors swung shut. The ballroom remained quiet for a moment. Then someone began to applaud, slowly, and the rest of the room followed. 6 months later, the Crown had concluded its work. My father was convicted on 2 counts under Section 46 of the Criminal Code of Canada and sentenced to life imprisonment without eligibility for parole for 25 years. He will be 78 years old before he may appear before a parole board. Colin received a concurrent sentence covering fraud, breach of trust, conspiracy, and a single count of treason. His law license was revoked within the month. His name was removed from every wall and letterhead of the Bay Street firm he had spent 15 years constructing. Portia was convicted on conspiracy charges and sentenced to 8 years. Every asset registered in her name, including the Whistler property she had discussed so carefully over dinner in Rosedale, was seized and liquidated by the court. My mother was not convicted. She had not known the full scope of what her husband and son had built. She knew enough to have said nothing for a very long time, and that was the weight she would carry on her own. She was last seen leaving the Rosedale house with 2 suitcases, while federal officers finished their inventory of the contents. She did not look back at the house as she went. The Rosedale house was seized by the Crown. After proceedings concluded, it was transferred to a national organization supporting Canadian Armed Forces veterans experiencing housing instability after discharge. It became transitional housing. The Lauren Harris painting, the group of 7-piece my grandfather had bought in the 1960s, the one my father had hidden his safe behind for 30 years, was donated to the Art Gallery of Ontario in my grandfather's name. It hangs in a room with natural light now, which is what it always deserved. The property in Prince Edward County remained mine. I spent 2 weekends that autumn clearing the overgrowth around the dock and replacing a section of the old fence along the eastern edge of the property. It was quiet work, the kind that asks nothing of you except your hands and your attention. On a Sunday in November, I stood on the dock and looked out across the lake. The water was gray and still, and the maples along the far bank had gone past their color into bare branch. My breath hung in the cold air. There was no sound except the water, and somewhere above me a pair of Canada geese crossing the sky in a wide, unhurried arc. My family had believed that a government salary and a uniform without a private firm's letterhead made me the smallest person in any room. They believed that work done in silence, in classified facilities, in rooms that most Canadians would never see and never know existed, was worth less than a Bay Street retainer and a Whistler chalet and a gilded invitation card. They were wrong about almost everything. But what they were most catastrophically wrong about was this. They thought I had no power because my power was invisible. They thought that because they had never seen my work, it did not exist. They had confused what could not be publicly credited with what could not matter. Service is not diminished by silence, it is defined by it. I stayed on the dock until the cold drove me inside. I made tea and sat by the window and watched the last of the light leave the lake, and I did not think about any of them at all. They had made their decisions. I had made mine, and the country I had spent 15 years quietly protecting was still standing. That was enough. It had always been enough.